Sorry, I'll crop it. I'll crop it. I have to. I was playing it before because I like this song, so it's actually good. Okay, all right. Well, you folks on the internet, welcome back to Presbygirls. I'm here. Sarah is here. We're happy to be bringing you another installment of our not frequent but fun Presbygirls episodes. We were actually reflecting on the frequency with which we published these episodes earlier, and I honestly think so many podcasts publish issues basically hot out of the gate. And I feel like less is more. I feel like you're more likely to listen to a podcast episode that comes out every 6 months as opposed, it's special.
That's our story. We're sticking to it.
That's exactly. Well, thanks for joining us once again on the interwebs. We have a very fun special guest with us today, Pastor Matt Everhard. He's a PCA pastor. We'll have you tell him tell you a little bit more about himself. All I have to say is there is not only one miraculous thing that took place in Butler, Pennsylvania this year. Matthew is a pastor in Pennsylvania. He actually lives in the Butler area. Not to give him too much, not to dox you, Matt, but
no, that's okay.
Pretty exciting. So tell us a little bit about yourself, as much or as little as you'd like, just who you are, where you're from, about your family, just a few little opening details, and we'll get right into it.
Yeah, thanks for that. I really appreciate it. Thanks for having me on. This is going to be great. Well, I am Matthew Everhard. I'm the pastor of Gospel Fellowship, PCA. We're about 30 minutes north of Pittsburgh. It's a great little church. If you want a Bible-believing Reformed church that loves Christ and wants to share the gospel with the world, come check us out in real life. Be glad to have you. I'm also an adjunct professor at RPTS, the Reformed Presbyterian Theological Seminary in Pittsburgh. Love to have you in class as well at some point. If you want to come get your master's degree or your doctoral degree, we'd love to have you at RPTS.
That's great. Well, Matt, you had a daughter get married earlier this summer.
Yes.
Tell us about your wife. Tell us about your kids. How many do you have?
Yeah, thanks for asking. Well, that's a kind of a complicated question, believe it or not, because so yes, my oldest daughter, Soraya, just got married. Her and Tom live in Philadelphia. Tom is going to be a doctor and Soraya is a nurse. So we're very proud of them. We also have my son, Elijah, who's 20 years old. And then we have a daughter, Simone, who is 15 years old. So there's 3 of them. Now there was 4 of them just a little bit ago. We had our niece living with us as well. So our house is, it's action-packed. It's fun. I love it. I love being a dad. I'm kind of in a strange phase though, because, and maybe you guys will be there soon. Sarah, you're not there yet, but man, when one of them actually grows up and moves out, it's the weirdest thing because you love them and you wish we just become our parents. We're sitting there waiting for our kids to call us on the phone. That's most of my life now. It's just hoping Soraya calls.
Oh, that's really sweet.
I know. Yeah, I know. It's a different phase. It's a whole different phase of life.
Well, I hope to experience that someday. I am the oldest child who was the first to leave home. So I'm sure I know that was an interesting and weird experience for my parents, but it's just another phase in your family's life. And it sounds like you have a great relationship with your kids. You love them. I'm just wondering what it was like to raise them in the household of a Presbyterian minister. I mean, I don't know how long you've been Presbyterian. Maybe you can talk to us a little bit about that, but just what it was like to raise kids in the ministry.
Yeah. Well,
any tips for the rest of us?
Ooh, yeah, we're barely surviving. So I don't know if I have any tips. That'd be great necessarily. But yeah, I've been a pastor my whole vocational professional life. So my kids have never had anything but dad being a pastor. So I know a lot of different pastors come into ministerial vocation from, another career. Maybe they were an engineer or something and they got tired of that and they went into the ministry. But for me, my kids were raised with dad as the pastor. And so there was nothing else that they ever knew or experienced. I will say that going back to Soraya, my oldest, she's kind of in a new phase too, where this is the first time I've not been her pastor on a weekly basis. So that's kind of interesting. And going off to a different town, different city, her and her husband are checking out some different churches, and she always gives me the lowdown of why that church is not fully Presbyterian. So I love hearing her feedback because it's really cool. It's really cool to see like what she expects from a church and what she thinks is anomalous and unusual. She's texted me many times like, Dad, is this normal? And sometimes I'm like, no, that's not, they should not be doing that. And other times I'm like, yeah, that sounds decent. That's legit. But we've had a lot of difficulties in our family because I don't know if you know this, but in my greater family, my sister was a heroin addict who was a homeless prostitute for almost 20 years. And so she, unfortunately, I love her. She's great. I'm very thankful for her, but brought a lot of chaos into our lives. And everybody would admit that. She ended up having 5 children in the course of all of her various journeys. And each time my sister had a child, the family had to scramble to figure out how we were going to cover for that new child that came into the world. And God, is so gracious and merciful to us. We were able to do it. But the reason I said it's hard for me to answer how many kids we have is because my family has had to scramble in a lot of ways just to make sure that each one of the 5 kids had a roof over their head. And sometimes they come and sometimes they go. It has been a wild adventure, and I wouldn't prescribe what happened to anybody. So sometimes I do feel like I'm barely holding on just because the burdens can be pretty heavy. And even recently, I'm going to try not to get emotional, but we've had a lot of pain in the last month. We've some difficulties and trials related to all of this. It's still ongoing, and by God's grace, we carry on day by day.
Well, that's great to hear. I think it is really encouraging just to hear that that you have a strong bond with your children, but you also admit, it's not immediately easy. I appreciate the fact that you're still positive about your relationship with your children and how they evaluate the world, having left your home. I think there's a, at least online, I see an attitude with pastors, especially ones with families, of like, my life is uniquely difficult and it's uniquely sad because I'm a pastor and because my children are pastors' kids. And there's kind of like a despondency in that I don't sense that from you, even though you're sharing a few difficult details of your story. So I think it's really helpful with what you're sharing to remember that there can be redeeming qualities of having your dad as a pastor. Your daughter has discernment when she goes out and joins churches that she may not have had, given the fact that you're a pastor. And it sounds like you trained her well. So I really enjoy hearing about that.
Have you been at Gospel Fellowship? How long have you been there?
We've been here 5 years. And before that, we were at a church in Florida for 11 years. And I was actually EPC before I was PCA. Okay. So I am glad that I made the jump from the EPC to the PCA for theological reasons. But, going back to family struggles, if I can just be really honest, and I'm one of those people that's an open book. Like, I've been very free to share some of my struggles with anxiety and panic attacks and health concerns this way and that. I will say this, that as online as I am with the YouTube channel and other things, publications and whatnot, I don't ever want to give people the impression that I have everything all together and that people should be like me in every sense, because while there may be some things that look very orderly and healthy, like I said, man, there's been a lot of real difficulties in our family. And so I've never tried to be anybody but myself. Even when I came to Gospel Fellowship from Florida, I explicitly told the search committee, as well as the full congregation, I said, look, our church in Florida was pretty great, and they loved us and they treated us good. The main reason why I'm coming back north is because I have to be closer to my family. My family and Kelly's family are all from Northeast Ohio, and there's been real hardship and difficulty. And I felt a burden as a son and as a brother to come back and to help to restore some kind of order and unity to our family. Kelly and I felt called by God, not only to be at the church that we're at, which we love, Gospel Fellowship's great, but we also felt this kind of sonship and daughterliness, that we owed an obligation to our own parents as they were getting older, to be close and proximate, because whenever this proverbial stuff hits the fan, we wanted to be there to be able to help out with that. And so, yeah, it's been hard. It's been crazy. And it's all joy though. And I love it. And I think here's one thing. I'll just say this. My kids do not resent growing up in the church. They think it's good and they think it's healthy. And that is like soulless to my heart, because I know what that means is that ultimately God has been good.
Yes.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. The whole idea that, people have told me several times, oh, your kids are pastors' kids. They're going to hate Sean's job. They're going to end up hating the church. They're going to go crazy. And, I knew several pastors' kids growing up. That's exactly what happened. But I mean, were there specific things that you and your wife specifically did that were like, we're not going to talk about our frustrations in front of the kids, or we're not going to bring church drama up on the dinner table, or we're not going, was there anything like that you said, we're not going to cross this barrier? You can't hide everything from the kids, and you shouldn't, because that's, the realness of it, of kids growing up and learning, yeah, there are hypocrites in the church. Yeah, the church, there's a lot of people that's messed up. There's a lot of people that say that they're Christians, and they probably are, and they've got a long way to go in their journey in sanctification. And so do you, apparently, as you have to deal with them. So that part is healthy for kids to see, so they don't expect this gleaming white ivory tower of churches. But what were some of the things that you and your wife said, we're not doing this?
I've probably erred in many ways in my life. But if I erred in this, I was probably more open with what was going on in the church than less, because I thought that discussing these real matters was ultimately going to be helpful in the long run. I never thought it was a good idea to try to present the church as like this perfect bubble of peace and unity and harmony at all times, only to have that bubble popped dramatically later on when they were in their late adolescence or early adulthood. So if I erred, it was more in like just talking about stuff. We talked about drama. We talked about sometimes church disciplinary situations. We talked about struggles of various kinds. The one thing that I really drew the line on, and I do think this was probably a good idea, is whenever people critiqued me as a person, I did not bring that to the dinner table and talk about that, because I didn't want my kids to resent certain people in the church as critics of their dad, because as you know, we're fiercely loyal to the people that we love. And if we even get a whiff of an idea that somebody despises our wives or husbands or kids or whatever, it's hard not to then return that with more despisal, if that's a word. And so that's one thing I just never did. I just never told my kids who's mad at me or who doesn't like me. I just never really went there. But as far as church difficulties, we talked about stuff. And I think that gave them a pretty realistic perspective of the church is very good, but it's not a utopia. It's great. It's God's mechanism for his kingdom, and it's God's ordained plan that we all be in the life of the church, but it's not a pain-free zone. There are real hurts there.
So when I told Sean that we were having you on, he's like, Matt Everhard. He's like, isn't he the Jonathan Edwards guy? So, you've done several in the midst of all of the chaos and extra kids and your own ministry. You've written several books, and was Jonathan Edwards your topic of study during seminary, or did you get a master's or anything like that?
Yeah. So Edwards was my doctoral dissertation focus when I was
Okay.
at RTS Orlando. So I wrote my dissertation on Jonathan Edwards' theology of joy or happiness under Michael Allen, who's just the best. He's a great professor at RTS. So I loved Edwards. And the reason I chose Edwards was because of his fascination with joy. Edwards is known for Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, but even there's hints of joy and happiness at the end if you get to the end. But everything Edwards writes, he's talking about happiness somewhere in his resolutions or his major theses or his sermons, his personal writings. There's constant sub-theme. There's like this golden thread of joy and happiness that runs throughout. Yeah.
And you've just written, I'm going to put this up in front of my really terrible camera screen. Here we go. Zoe, you do it. Thank you.
Sorry.
Save me. Save it for me.
I have the FaceTime camera on, so hopefully this works. Yep,
Yeah.
here it is.
Worshiptainment, the Modern Church's Golden Calf. This was just recently out. So tell me, I have one question, more than one question, but my main question is, what motivated you to write this? And, because a lot of what you're talking about, some of it happens in PCA churches, but more of it is just general evangelical churches. So, you're a PCA pastor. Why would you write a book on worshiptainment to modern evangelical world? Because when a lot of us think of that, it's like, it's too daunting to even touch. Where do you even start? So what was your motivation?
Well, it's a critique. It's a polemical work. It's kind of a shot across the bow of some of the more extreme forms of what I call worshiptainment, which is the combination of some aspects of Christian worship with a lot of entertainment practicalities that are borrowed from the secular world, especially Hollywood, Nashville, and Broadway, just kind of brought into the church. And in my view, diluting worship and even perverting it to some extent. So I was perturbed. I wrote it from a perspective of perturbation, that I'm annoyed. And I think that comes across a little bit in the book. It's sometimes sarcastic. Sometimes I hope it comes across as a little bit funny. Some of the examples I give are ridiculously sublime, things that have actually happened in churches. But I've people have asked me this before, and my answer is I feel like Paul felt when he was in Athens in Acts chapter 17, when he sees the idols and his spirit is provoked. And sometimes when we're provoked by something that we think is wrong or unjust or evil or not meeting the standard of God's word, we're prompted to say something about it. And I thought to myself, I see so much of this egregious distortion of what looks like worship and people being attracted to it in large droves. And I want people to experience something more like what we experience in Reformed worship, with a very word-centered liturgy and a strong emphasis on the ordinary means of grace and expository preaching. Some of the things that we value, that you and I, Zoe and Sarah, we would not give these things up. Even if they bent our fingers back, it's like, no, I'm not giving up on these beautiful things. And the powers that God prescribes in Scripture, what he wants us to do in worship. And that's powerful. And I just want people to, I want every church to come a little bit closer to biblical forms of worship. And I'm not saying that we do it right. I don't know that we do. I don't know that Gospel Fellowship has the perfect liturgy. I'm not claiming that we do. The Bible doesn't actually give us an order of worship that is, you can't turn to some chapter in Colossians and find the order of worship that Paul wants us to have.
The specific liturgy.
Yeah. But the principles are there. And I think straying far from the principles is a dangerous thing. So we call that the regulative principle of worship, that God has prescribed for us in the Scriptures what we're supposed to do when we worship. And that's the best, safest place to be.
Yeah, and you do mention this in your book. There's a section dedicated to the Covenanters, and that a lot of the freedoms that we have to practice worship in the ways that we think honor God best were actually hard won against religious movements that often were associated with political power, with the Covenanters and their struggles against the imposition of the Book of Common Prayer, things like that. And I mean, the struggle in today's day and age with the modern American evangelical is cultural tradition, but then also the idolatry of our hearts. We have all the freedom in the world to do whatever we want, but the dark side of that is we have all the freedom in the world to do whatever we want.
Yeah.
And so I really appreciate I really appreciate what you're saying about what drove you to write the book. And I'm wondering, what kind of audience did you have in mind for the book? Obviously, as fellow NAPARC Presbyterians, Sarah and I are going to agree with pretty much all of what's in the book, but did you think it might reach maybe an outside NAPARC audience? What did you have in mind for that?
Well, obviously I want the book to be read as broadly as possible because I think many different kinds of people will benefit from it. I think people like you guys and myself, if you were to read the book, you'd probably find yourself cheering for me, like, yeah, that's what we do. Yeah. But I also want broader evangelicals and even like non-denominationals to read it. And although they're probably not going to be familiar with the Westminster Confession of Faith to the extent that we are, I did want some people to feel a little bit of conviction that's like, oh, maybe some of what we do is actually pretty cringy. And it would probably be better if we conformed some of our practices to more of a scriptural, even historical model of what worship has looked like in Christian churches throughout the ages. So I think for Presbyterians, they're going to find themselves kind of like liking it and maybe even buttressing some of their own understandings. A few technical terms I define very carefully so people can understand it. But I'm kind of hoping that some generic evangelicals get a hold of it somehow. And maybe they don't like it, but that'd be fine too, I guess. I just want people to think about biblical worship.
That's one of provoking.
Yeah, well, and that's one of the ways that people learn, though. And I think it sometimes can get discouraging being in. I mean, our camp gets called stuffy and judgmental, and we're just the naysayers and the grumpy, stiff old people who are just always yelling at people for not doing things right. But a lot of the ways that people learn is reading something that they don't like and emotionally reacting to it.
Yeah.
But you have to be, a lot of us are sometimes in that line of fire of you have to start the conversation. You're going to get some people riled up, but that gets them thinking because it gets under their skin and they think about it and they think about it and they think about it. And then they think about it some more and they read something else. And slowly, if something's gotten under your skin enough to where to get you, a little bit irked, it does cause you to, well, why do I believe what I believe? And where is it in the Bible? And am I actually correct? That was the way that I learned in college. I came to Reformed convictions kicking and screaming. I mean, it was, I feel like I'll issue a broad apology to the whole campus. But I mean, I remember that's how I came. And the regulative principle of worship was another one that I was like, this is the most offensive thing I have ever heard. And then, 2 years later, I'm reading it out of a book cover. So
yeah.
You have to start the conversation, and sometimes getting under people's skin is sort of the first step.
So Sarah, in that vein, what offended you about the regulative principle? I mean, I'm curious because I'm sure that your reaction is not unique.
No, the idea that someone can say your music is worse than mine, yours is better, or mine is better, or yours is, the whole idea of beauty is wrapped up in this a lot. And that was also something that I had to work through with a few of my professors who were incredibly helpful. Dr. Paul Munson, a lot of his writings, lectures on beauty and what its purpose is and how to understand that from a Christian perspective was extremely helpful in the entire regulative principle, because, just the idea that, well, God didn't say we couldn't. I had more of a Lutheran understanding, more of a normative
idea.
Yeah. And even becoming a mom, I can look at my kids and walk into the living room while they're prancing around the furniture doing things they're not supposed to do. And even my kids know that, well, Mom, you didn't say that we couldn't do blah, 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 blah. Well, you guys knew. I have never said that you couldn't throw the pillows over top of the bookshelf and slam your brother in the head with the back of Calvin's Institutes. But you know instinctively that you're not supposed to do that. Okay. We've had similar rules you can infer. And a lot of that was just gradual learning and realizing, okay, there are principles and commandments and things that you can infer from the New Testament, where Paul does say, do it like this and do it like this. And as Matt said, it's not perfect. I'm not sure that we all have the absolute perfect order of worship, but you want to try to be as biblical as possible. Instead of, well, I just want to do what I want to do because my biggest thing was I am sentimentally or emotionally attached to my style, but my sentimentality and my emotions aren't worth anything because I'm not worshiping me and I'm not worshiping my tastes. I'm worshiping a holy God who has told me how I should, and I should probably listen to that. It was a hard journey.
I think I can put my finger on the offense. I think I can, because when Jesus in John 4 talks about worshiping in spirit and truth, he's talking about two categories. So there's spirit and there's truth. And I think a lot of common generic evangelicals, they assume that as long as worship is sincere, then it really doesn't matter what kind of outward form or manifestation that worship takes. So they're analyzing worship only on the sincerity principle, but there's also the truth principle. And if you kind of line those up, worship has to be both true and sincere in order to be acceptable to God. Both of those have to be true. If the worship is true but insincere, then obviously that's false worship.
Yes.
If the worship is false but sincere, we're arguing that that's actually still false worship. And if it's false worship and insincere, then that's the worst of all worlds, because none of it. So the thing about the regulative principle is that we're actually making a pretty restrictive argument that for worship to be pleasing to God, not only does it have to be sincere as far as the heart goes, which, like, obviously, everybody agrees with that, but also it has to be in accordance with what he says that he desires from us in worship. And that, I think, is the rub. That's the thing that comes across as offensive to some people.
Yeah, you get a lot of like, well, I'm very sincere in my worship. How dare you tell me that I'm not worshiping? And it's like, that's okay, exactly well, it's also the equating of worship. You've seen in a lot of people's order of service that you have a time of worship and then you have the sermon. So the worship is only the music.
Right.
Or you have, the worship is equated with my feelings, which is why we have to increase in volume at the same time, at the same point in the same verse, every time we sing the same song, so we can get, the emotional manipulation going. I mean, as a musician, you see some of this and you think, wait, I know what's going on. I know exactly what's going on. This is a little bit manipulative. But even as a layperson, you're thinking, okay, this happens kind of the same way. This has been super commercialized. What do you think about the the transition that we've come from, like, the early 80s, the dawning of sort of Christian contemporary music, some of them in the 60s and 70s, but more so, I think, 80s. You got Keith Green coming out, and then you have I grew up in 90s contemporary Christian, Michael W. Smith, Stephen Curtis Chapman, Michael Card. And now we have, I don't even know what to call what we have now. Irritation to my eardrums is what it is now, but I'm a snobby music person. But what do you see in the progression of contemporary music, and why your book is just so absolutely pivotal and important when it comes to what we're letting in our services?
Well, here's a positive. So even though the book, it is a critique of certain kinds of worship, no doubt about that. Here's the positive. I'm noticing, and tell me what you guys are experiencing in your churches too, that a lot of the younger generation, I'm talking about the people that are in their 20s and in their 30s, some of the people that are just getting married or just having babies, they actually don't want the kind of lights and lasers and fog machines type of service because they don't think it's very impressive. And the reason I think that they don't think it's very impressive is because they grew up with the internet and they can see all kinds of things on screens. And so, screens and jumbotrons and stuff like that and video intros, it's not a big deal to them. They're actually looking for something much more authentic and real. And so I don't know about you guys as churches, because we're all in different geographic locations, but here, the people that are coming in their 20s, they would probably be mad if we kind of tried to introduce any of that stuff. I think the boomers, and not to make this a generational thing, the boomers were impressed by screens and lights because it wasn't what they were experiencing when they were young.
Very
so all of
novel.
those innovations to them were kind of like, oh, you could do this in church, and they thought it was cool. But now that that's become the fad, the younger generation is ironically going back to older forms because they're looking for authenticity and not some kind of demonstrative show. And so for me, that's like a pretty positive trend right now.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there are statistical realities to that as well. I was just seeing some statistics. They're not massive. So, I mean, there's really limited usefulness to them, but there are trends that suggest that younger people are leaning more towards more traditional worship.
Mm-hmm.
But on the opposite side of that, a lot of the young people that are wanting more traditional worship because they don't get in with the kitsch of the boomer laser light show of the 90s, maybe they were raised evangelical and they want something better, they usually don't come to a regulative principle church. That's kind of rare as far as I can tell. It's usually Anglican or Eastern Orthodox. I actually have a friend who that's the case for her and her husband. They went to a non-denominational church and then they ended up becoming Anglican because of the richness of the liturgy. And your book mentions this a little bit, but there is kind of a converse effect of kind of ancient feeling liturgy. And it's difficult to condemn them for wanting that, but there is an element to that is very similar. I feel like that there are rituals that kind of make you feel better. And again, I mean, not to be overly condemnative because I have friends who are in this position. And of course you're like, well, I don't want you to go hear, Pastor Joe talk about how he was in baseball 20 years ago for the, 100th time on a Sunday. But yeah, it's interesting. Have you noticed that as well? Like, would you describe the more ancient worship in the same way that you would describe like the idolatry that you pinpoint evangelical worship? Does that make sense? Have you noticed that?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And right now I'm kind of envisioning like a 3-part Venn diagram in my mind where you have regulative principle worship over here. You have something in the middle, which would be like your Anglican, Lutheran, and even Orthodox kind of manifestations. And then you have your worshiptainment stuff over here, which obviously I'm against. And they each have some commonality. So for instance, the Lutheran, Anglican, and Presbyterian stuff, we have tradition and history in common. So there's an overlap there. Whereas the Lutheran and Anglican has a lot of visual demonstration that is also inherent in worshiptainment. And so those two have something in common as well. And from our perspective, what they have in common is also concerning because a lot of it is innovation. It's just from different centuries or even innovations in different millennia. And what we're asking is that we actually aren't just looking for history's sake, but actually we want to be so historical that we're actually even biblical, right? So I appreciate the impulse because those who are moving from the worshiptainment to the Anglican or Orthodox position, they're doing that because they want something that is more profound and more authentic. So that's a good impulse. They should be looking for that. But in my view, unfortunately, maybe they haven't gone quite as far as they ought to. And so they're still enchanted by some of the so-called smells and bells of that particular model of worship, which, we would have our own concerns with for various reasons.
Yeah. Now, I don't know if you noticed me and Zoe just about cracking up here, but there is love the book. There is one thing towards the end that we have got to haze you about. And
we have
to talk to you about the dark octagon.
Octagon. And
the dark octagon.
I know
it's a UFC reference, okay? Like the octagon.
Oh, well, we should have got Resby on here. He would have known everything about the dark octagon.
And I texted Zoe. I was like, Zoe, have you heard of the dark octagon? I was like some Marvel character gone wrong. Or like, Mom, we want Marvel. We have Marvel at home. Here's the dark octagon.
The dark octagon.
Yeah.
That was so funny. Oh my goodness.
It's
so
amazing.
do I need to excise that from the second edition if I ever revise it?
No, you need to
get
keep
rid of
it
it
as like, I appreciated that the
foreboding name.
The graphics in this book are very simple, very plain. You obviously did not have somebody who had the lights and fogs do the graphic design for your book.
Okay.
And I think it just fits. It like fits the ethos. So just
No,
keep
it definitely
You
does.
better keep it. But I have to haze
Okay.
you about it just because it's
Okay.
hilarious.
We
Yeah,
thought it was pretty
yeah.
funny, the Dark Octagon.
Great. Thank you. I appreciate that.
You didn't employ the same bad reasoning that you accuse evangelicals of employing in their worship services. So
Yes.
it's very fitting.
Thank
It's
you.
great.
It's probably fitting that, Zoe, we have a guest on and then we immediately start hazing them. So
No, I
so
like
fitting.
it. I deserve it for sure.
but that chapter is actually towards the end. We sort of talked about this in your other one, but in the other podcast that we did with Matt, I think is going to be on his channel.
Mhm.
But the book is more than just the regulative principle of worship and let's beat people over the heads with this for 200 pages. You go into all sorts of things. I mean, you talk about you obviously talk about worship and music, but you go into liturgy. You talk a lot about the sacraments. You touch on the rise of the pastor influencer,
Which is where the Dark Octagon comes from.
Yes.
Mhm.
So, I mean, there's a lot more than just let's rail about psalm singing for 170 pages. It was good, because worship is more than just music. Worship is more than just preferences. Worship is the entire service, and I appreciated especially that last chapter. Was worship is not centered around one guy.
Mhm. Mhm.
So yeah, I highly recommend, and yeah, good job. But yeah,
Thank
the
you so
graphics
much.
got me sometimes.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Yes.
Oh. So Matt, tell us what your YouTube channel is called, how to subscribe, what's all the lingo for that?
Yeah, so it's just my name, Matthew Everhard, and I talk about all kinds of stuff. I started off doing just book and Bible reviews, and then I got into a lot more theological kind of talking head stuff. I do some historical stuff that's a little bit niche. Obviously, I bring in Jonathan Edwards quite a few times, but I've also been talking about the Covenanters lately, and sometimes some current events as well. Basically, it's whatever I feel like talking about on any given morning. It's not a super polished show. I don't have high-end graphics or anything like that. It's very basic, and basically whatever I'm thinking about on my morning run, that's what I talk about on that particular day.
We have absolutely no experience in non-polished, right, Zoe?
Right. We don't.
I love it.
Be polished around here. It's authentic. We feel very authentic. doing this.
Authentic. Oh my gosh, that is like the worst millennial word ever.
We're like so
Just
real and authentic.
All right. Zoe, I'll let you close this out.
Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you so much to Matt for agreeing to come on and talk to us a little bit about life as a pastor and also worship issues. It's quite relevant to our modern context, both as Presbyterians and in the PCA, where we all live and serve. Well, our husbands serve and Matt serves, but we just live in it. I'm really looking forward to seeing how a continued discussion in these issues affects some of our General Assembly's decisions, like on the directory for public worship. I think some of the questions that we talked about here are going to be very relevant to that. I'm very passionate about the directory for worship. I think it's amazing. But please check out Matt's YouTube channel. He does a fantastic job. And please check out Worshiptainment if you'd like a handy guide on the regulative principle and some of the pitfalls that we can all experience in worship, not just Napark Presbyterians, but the rest of us. But for now, Presbygirls out. And as always, have to remind you, don't enter the Dark Octagon and never hit people over the head with stools because you're not Jenny Geddes, no matter how much you want to.